After I refused to hand over my inheritance, my mom invited me to a family meeting. When I showed up, there were lawyers waiting, ready to pressure me into signing it away. But as they slid the papers across the table, I just smiled and said, "Funny, I brought someone too." And that's when my own attorney walked in with documents that changed everything. There are moments in life when you realize the people who should protect you are actually the ones you need protection from. For me, that moment came last year when my beloved Grandpa Harold left me an inheritance of $1,200,000, and my mother, who'd abandoned me as a child, suddenly wanted back in my life, or rather, in my bank account. When I refused to fund her gambling addiction, she invited me to a family dinner that was nothing short of an ambush. Lawyers were ready, papers were drawn, and they expected me to sign everything over. But when those documents slid across the table, I just smiled. And what I said next changed everything. Growing up in Portland was tough. My parents had a bitter divorce when I was 8, and my mother, Diane, chose parties and a parade of new boyfriends over being a parent. My dad moved across the country and barely called. It was Grandpa Harold who stepped in and became my world. Grandpa was a self-made man. He built his construction company from nothing, and even without much formal education, he understood people and business in a way that always amazed me. After the divorce, he convinced my mom I should live with him temporarily. That temporary arrangement became my permanent childhood home, and I couldn't have been more grateful. Our modest 3-bedroom house was my sanctuary. He even built me a tree house in the backyard. "Becky," he'd say, "this is your thinking spot. When life gets too noisy, climb up here and listen to the quiet." Our weekend fishing trips to Trillium Lake were some of my fondest memories. We'd wake before dawn, stop for pancakes, and hit the water. "Fishing teaches patience," he'd tell me. "And life rewards those who know how to wait for the right moment." He was teaching me about so much more than just catching trout. I just didn't realize it then. When I struggled with math, Grandpa would sit with me for hours, never losing patience. "Numbers tell stories if you know how to listen," he'd explain. By high school, I was helping him with his business's books, and that's where my love for accounting began. Watching columns of numbers transform into a clear picture of success or failure under his guidance was fascinating. Meanwhile, my mother's visits grew rare. She'd show up with extravagant gifts for Christmas or my birthday, always with a new boyfriend, but never staying long enough for a real conversation. She'd promise more time together, then disappear for months. Grandpa never spoke ill of her, but his tight-lipped expression when she canceled plans said everything. "Your mother loves you in her way," he'd say. "Some people aren't built for everyday caring. They're more like fireworks, bright and exciting, but brief." I tried college right after high school, studying business at Portland State. But halfway through my sophomore year, financial reality hit hard. Even with scholarships and a part-time job, I couldn't make ends meet. Grandpa offered to help, but his business had taken a hit during the recession, and I couldn't add to his burdens. So I dropped out, planning to return when I'd saved enough. I found a full-time job as a bookkeeper assistant, moved into a tiny apartment, and started putting away every penny. Education never expires, Grandpa assured me. Sometimes the path winds a bit before reaching the destination. 3 years later, with his encouragement, I re-enrolled, this time pursuing accounting. I was more focused, more determined, and, honestly, a better student at 23 than I had been at 18. Then came the phone call that changed everything. Grandpa had gone for a routine checkup, only to be diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer. The prognosis was grim, months, not years. I immediately moved back into my childhood home to care for him. Those final months were precious and heartbreaking. We had conversations we'd never had before about life, death, regrets, and pride. "I've had a good run," he told me one evening as we sat on the porch swing, watching the sunset. "Built something from nothing, loved deeply, and had the privilege of raising you. That's more than most get." As he grew weaker, our roles reversed. I helped him with medications, prepared his meals, and read to him. During one particularly lucid moment, he gripped my hand. "Rebecca," he said, using my full name as he always did for serious matters, "I'm leaving everything to you. Not because you've cared for me, though I'm grateful, but because you'll honor what I've built. Promise me you'll use it wisely. Don't let your mother waste it on her schemes and dreams." I promised, through tears, though the inheritance wasn't on my mind, only the imminent loss of the person who had been my true parent. Grandpa passed peacefully in his sleep, his hand in mine. The funeral was a blur. Many faces from the construction industry came to pay respects to a man known for his integrity. My mother arrived late, in a black dress that seemed more appropriate for a cocktail party than a funeral. She hugged me briefly, her perfume overwhelming, before whispering, "When's the reading of the will?" Mr. Goldstein, my grandfather's lawyer and friend of 30 years, held the reading the following week. My mother sat beside me, fidgeting with her bracelet and checking her phone. When Mr. Goldstein revealed that Grandpa had left everything to me, except for $50,000 to my mother, her gasp was audible. "This can't be right," she insisted, color rising in her cheeks. "Harold wouldn't do this to me. I'm his daughter." Mr. Goldstein, a man whose silver hair and calm demeanor commanded respect, simply adjusted his glasses and continued. The inheritance included $800,000 in investments, the family home valued at $350,000, and Grandpa's classic car collection worth approximately $100,000. My mother stormed out before he finished, slamming the heavy oak door behind her. He then handed me a sealed envelope, a personal letter from Grandpa, to be read privately. That night, alone in what was now my house, I opened his letter. In his familiar handwriting, slightly shaky from his illness, he explained his decision. He detailed years of lending money to my mother that was never repaid, bailouts from gambling debts, and even selling valuable family heirlooms to fund her lifestyle. The letter ended with words I'll never forget. "You are not just my granddaughter, but the daughter of my heart. Trust yourself as I have trusted you." I was 27, had just completed my accounting degree, and was working an entry-level position. The inheritance meant security, opportunity, and a chance to honor Grandpa's legacy, not instant luxury or an escape from responsibility, as my mother might have chosen. The first call came 3 days after the funeral. My mother, suddenly concerned about medical bills that needed immediate attention. When I asked for details, the story changed to needing a new car because hers had broken down. I offered to look at the car and help find a reasonable replacement. She declined and hung up. This was just the beginning of what would become an increasingly aggressive campaign to get her hands on my inheritance. The temperature outside matched my mood, cold and growing colder, when my mother made her first unannounced visit to the house exactly 3 weeks after Grandpa's funeral. I was sorting through his files when the doorbell rang repeatedly, followed by insistent knocking. "Rebecca, open up. It's an emergency." Her voice was pitched with urgency, and my heart immediately raced. I rushed to open it, imagining accidents or illness, only to find her perfectly fine, if slightly disheveled. She brushed past me into the house, her designer purse clashing with her worn jeans and hasty ponytail. "Thank God you're home," she said, surveying the living room with quick, assessing eyes. "I need your help with something urgent." That emergency turned out to be her desire for a facelift and tummy tuck combination that her current boyfriend had supposedly promised to fund before temporarily facing cash flow issues. She spread glossy brochures from a plastic surgery clinic across Grandpa's coffee table, talking excitedly about the investment in her future. "Mom," I interrupted her, "I'm not paying for cosmetic surgery." Her expression shifted instantly from excitement to wounded betrayal. "I'm not asking for the world, Rebecca. Just a small portion of what your grandfather left you. Money that should have been partly mine anyway. I am his daughter. I'm happy to help with legitimate expenses," I offered. "If you have medical needs, bills, or even education costs, we can discuss those." That's when the first tantrum erupted. She paced the living room, voice rising as she listed all she'd sacrificed as a young mother, how unfair life had been to her, and how selfish I was being with family money. When tears and accusations didn't work, she switched to threats about contesting the will, claiming Grandpa wasn't of sound mind when he made it. He was in the hospital on medications, she argued. Any court would see he wasn't thinking clearly. I didn't tell her about the video Mr. Goldstein had wisely recorded 6 months before Grandpa's diagnosis, documenting his wishes and reasoning while in perfect health. She left that day without the check she'd come for. But this was just the opening salvo in a longer campaign. Within days, my Aunt Susan, my mother's older sister, called to check on me and casually suggest that sharing some inheritance with your mother would keep the peace in the family. Uncle Robert followed with similar sentiments, though his discomfort was evident. Then came the text messages from Carl, my mother's boyfriend of 2 years. A former real estate agent who'd lost his license over ethics violations, Carl had a smooth way of making threats sound like friendly advice. "Your mom's really hurting, Rebecca. Family should support family. It would be a shame if this situation got ugly when it doesn't have to." Over the next month, I pieced together the extent of my mother's financial troubles through conversations with family members and a few disturbing discoveries. She had maxed out multiple credit cards, faced eviction from her apartment for non-payment, and owed significant money to people Carl referred to as business associates, which I took to mean loan sharks or gambling creditors. The situation escalated dramatically when I received a call from a credit card company about suspicious activity. Someone had attempted to open a high-limit card in my name using my social security number and personal information. The company's fraud department caught it because the mailing address didn't match my current records. That address belonged to my mother. When confronted by phone, she broke down in tears, claiming desperate circumstances and promising it would never happen again. I wanted to believe her, but something in her too-practiced apology rang hollow. I filed fraud alerts with all 3 credit bureaus that same day. 2 weeks later, my workplace became her next target. I was in a meeting with clients when our receptionist, Lindsay, interrupted to tell me my mother was in the lobby, insisting it was an emergency. By the time I excused myself and reached the reception area, my mother was loudly telling anyone who would listen about how I was hoarding her rightful inheritance while she faced homelessness. My boss, Jessica, was understanding but concerned. "Your personal life is your business, Rebecca," she told me privately after security had escorted my mother out. "But we can't have scenes like this disrupting the office. Is there something I can do to help?" The humiliation burned deep. I'd worked hard to build a professional reputation, and in 10 minutes, my mother had threatened to unravel it. Next came the social offensive. Friends started receiving messages from my mother with carefully crafted stories about my breakdown following Grandpa's death, my irrational behavior, and how concerned she was about my mental health. All thinly veiled attempts to discredit me should I speak about her actions. Most saw through it, but the constant defense and explanation left me exhausted and increasingly isolated. I stopped answering unknown calls, reduced my social media presence, and became hesitant to attend gatherings where I might face questions, or worse, my mother might appear. My cousin Emma, who had always been more like a sister, called to warn me that things were escalating behind the scenes. "Aunt Diane is talking to Uncle Robert about lawyers," she whispered. She told me something about grounds to challenge the will. "She's serious, Becca." So, when my mother's text arrived, inviting me to a family dinner to make peace at Aunt Susan's house, my instincts screamed caution. Yet, a small part of me, the little girl who still wanted her mother's approval, hoped for genuine reconciliation. "I think we've both said things we regret," her message read. "Let's talk like adults over dinner. Susan's making her lasagna. Just family, I promise." I deliberated for days, finally deciding to go, but I went prepared. I slipped a small digital recorder into my purse, texted Emma the address and time with instructions to call if she didn't hear from me by 9 p.m., and drove to Aunt Susan's house with a knot of dread tightening in my stomach. As I turned onto the tree-lined street, the number of cars parked outside my aunt's modest home immediately triggered alarm bells. This wasn't just family as promised. My mother's red convertible sat in the driveway next to Uncle Robert's SUV and 2 unfamiliar vehicles, a black Mercedes sedan and a gray Lexus that screamed professionals. I sat in my car for nearly 5 minutes, considering driving away, but Grandpa's voice seemed to whisper in my ear, "Running from trouble only gives it a head start." With a deep breath, I gathered my courage and approached the front door. The moment I stepped into Aunt Susan's house, the conversation in the living room abruptly ceased. 6 pairs of eyes turned to me, and the silence felt like a physical weight pressing against my chest. The familiar scent of my aunt's lasagna wafting from the kitchen did nothing to dispel the tension crackling in the air. My mother rose from the sofa, dressed impeccably in a blue dress I'd never seen, her smile too wide and not reaching her eyes. "Rebecca, you made it. We were just about to give up on you." I catalogued the room quickly. Mother, Aunt Susan hovering nervously by the dining room entrance, Uncle Robert standing uncomfortably by the fireplace, Carl leaning against the wall with arms crossed, and 2 strangers. A middle-aged man and woman in expensive suits, sitting primly on the love seat. "Sorry I'm late," I said, though I was precisely on time. Traffic was heavier than expected. Aunt Susan rushed forward, her hug slightly too tight, her whispered, "I'm glad you came," carrying an undercurrent I couldn't quite interpret. She smelled of the same vanilla perfume she'd worn throughout my childhood, but there was something off about her usual warmth. "Rebecca, I'd like you to meet some friends of the family," my mother said smoothly, gesturing to the suited strangers. "This is Mr. Peterson and Miss Jenkins. They've been helping me sort through some paperwork." Mr. Peterson stood, offering a manicured hand and a practiced smile. "Pleasure to meet you, Rebecca. Your mother speaks highly of you." I doubted that very much. Miss Jenkins merely nodded, her assessment of me evident in the slight narrowing of her eyes. "Dinner's ready," Aunt Susan announced with forced cheerfulness. "Why don't we all sit down while it's hot?" The dining table was set with Aunt Susan's good china, the set reserved for Thanksgiving and Christmas. Another warning sign that this was no ordinary family dinner. I was directed to a seat between Uncle Robert and Mr. Peterson, directly across from my mother, Carl, and Miss Jenkins. Aunt Susan took the head of the table, her hands fidgeting with her napkin. Conversation during dinner was painfully superficial, whether local sports teams, a new restaurant downtown, all discussed with the careful neutrality of strangers in an elevator. No one mentioned Grandpa, the inheritance, or the purpose of this gathering. My mother kept refilling wine glasses, though I noticed she barely touched her own. As Aunt Susan cleared the dessert plates, my mother set down her napkin with deliberate care. "Well, I think it's time we discussed why we're all here." Mr. Peterson opened a sleek leather portfolio I hadn't noticed before, extracting several official-looking documents. "Rebecca, Your mother has been concerned about the distribution of your grandfather's estate. That's putting it mildly, my mother interjected with a tight laugh. We've prepared some documents, Miss Jenkins continued smoothly, that would create a more equitable arrangement for the family. Mr. Peterson slid the papers across the table. It's really quite straightforward. These documents establish a family trust that would manage the assets your grandfather left. All family members would benefit appropriately. I glanced at Uncle Robert, whose gaze was fixed firmly on his coffee cup. Aunt Susan had not returned from the kitchen. These are just formalities, my mother said, impatience edging into her tone. A way to make things fair, as Daddy would have wanted if he'd been thinking clearly. I looked down at the first page, skimming the dense legal language. Despite the complicated wording, the intent was clear. I would sign over control of all assets to a family trust, with my mother as the primary trustee. There were vague promises of distributions for my legitimate needs as determined by the trustee. In essence, I would be handing everything to my mother. Take your time, Miss Jenkins said, though her tapping finger suggested the opposite. But we do need to file these promptly to avoid further complications. Complications? I asked, looking up from the document. Legal challenges can be lengthy and expensive, Mr. Peterson explained with a sympathetic smile that didn't reach his eyes. This approach is much cleaner for everyone. I noticed Carl had shifted to stand near the doorway, his posture suggesting he was blocking the most direct exit. My mother's facade of pleasantness was thinning by the second, her smile now more grimace than grin. Just sign it, Rebecca, she said, pushing a pen toward me. Stop being so difficult. This is what family does. I'd like to read through everything first, I said, flipping to the second page. We don't have all night, Miss Jenkins remarked with poorly concealed irritation. My mother's mask finally slipped entirely. This is ridiculous. You're sitting on over $1 million that should have been shared with me from the beginning. I'm your mother, for God's sake. A mother who abandoned her at 8, Uncle Robert muttered, surprising everyone, including himself, judging by his widened eyes. Stay out of this, Robert, my mother snapped before turning back to me. Sign the papers, or we'll contest the will and tie you up in court for years. By the time the lawyers are done, there won't be anything left for either of us. My heart hammered in my chest. The room seemed to shrink, air thinning as panic rose in my throat. My vision tunneled briefly, the faces around the table blurring except for my mother's, sharp with anticipation and triumph. In that moment, I heard Grandpa's voice again, clear as day. When someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. He'd been quoting Maya Angelou, one of his favorite writers. I'd seen who my mother was repeatedly throughout my life. This ambush was merely the latest confirmation. The documents before me suddenly seemed absurd, a transparent attempt to steal what Grandpa had explicitly wanted me to have. A strange calm washed over me, replacing the panic of moments before. I smiled. Everyone at the table looked confused by this unexpected reaction. My mother's eyes narrowed suspiciously. Before I sign anything, I said, my voice steadier than I felt, I should probably call Mr. Goldstein. He specifically warned me about this scenario. The mention of Mr. Goldstein's name was like dropping a stone into still water. Ripples of reaction spread across every face at the table. My mother's complexion paled visibly, her confidence faltering for the first time that evening. That won't be necessary, Mr. Peterson said quickly. We can address any concerns you have right here. I allowed my smile to widen slightly, channeling the quiet confidence Grandpa had always shown in negotiations. I'm afraid I disagree. You see, Mr. Goldstein and I had a very specific conversation about the possibility of my mother attempting to contest the will or pressure me into relinquishing the inheritance. I turned directly to my mother. He showed me the provisions Grandpa included precisely to prevent this situation. Did you know that if you formally contest the will, your $50,000 inheritance automatically goes to the Children's Hospital Foundation? Grandpa thought of everything. Miss Jenkins and Mr. Peterson exchanged glances, a silent communication that suggested this was news to them. That's ridiculous, my mother sputtered, but the uncertainty in her voice betrayed her. I reached slowly into my purse, noting how everyone tensed as if I might pull out a weapon. Instead, I placed my small digital recorder on the table, its red light blinking steadily. I've been recording since I arrived, I said calmly. Oregon is a one-party consent state for audio recording, which means I don't need permission from anyone else in this conversation. Carl stepped forward from his position by the door. You can't do that. I also have documentation of every attempt my mother has made to harass me about the inheritance, I continued, pulling out my phone. Including this text from you, Carl. That could easily be construed as extortion. My lawyer suggested we might have grounds for a restraining order, especially after the scene at my workplace. I scrolled through my phone casually. Speaking of lawyers, mine is waiting for my call. I told him I'd check in by 9 o'clock to let him know everything was okay. That's about 10 minutes from now. The confidence around the table was dissolving rapidly. Mr. Peterson closed his portfolio with a snap. Miss Mitchell, it seems there's been a misunderstanding about the purpose of tonight's meeting. Has there? I asked, producing one more item from my purse, a folded copy of Grandpa's will, which I'd begun carrying with me everywhere. Because this document is very clear about my grandfather's intentions. Would you like me to read the relevant section? It's quite specific. Without waiting for a response, I unfolded the document and found the passage I'd practically memorized. I leave the remainder of my estate, including my home, investments, business interests, and personal property, to my granddaughter, Rebecca Mitchell, who has been the joy of my life and whose judgment I trust implicitly. I make this bequest with full knowledge of my daughter Diane's expectations, which I have chosen not to fulfill due to her persistent financial irresponsibility and disregard for family obligations. I looked up. There's more, including a detailed letter explaining his decision that's been filed with the probate court. The silence that followed was profound. I reached back into my purse and withdrew an envelope, the personal letter Grandpa had left me, which I brought on instinct. He wrote me a private letter too. Would you like to hear part of it? Again, I didn't wait for permission. Rebecca, I know Diane will likely try to convince you I was unfair or confused when making these decisions. The truth is simpler. Over the years, I've given your mother more than $300,000 to cover debts, bail her out of failed ventures, and fund her lifestyle. None was repaid. The last straw came when I discovered she had taken your grandmother's jewelry, pieces I'd saved for you, and sold them for gambling money. My mother's face contorted with rage and embarrassment. He had no right to tell you that. He had every right, I countered quietly, just as I have every right to honor his wishes by refusing to fund the behavior that disappointed him so deeply. I gathered my belongings and stood. I'm leaving now. Here's what happens next. You all leave me alone. No more surprise visits, no calls to my workplace, no manipulating family members into pressuring me. If any of that continues, I'll file for a restraining order and pursue any other legal remedies my lawyer recommends. I turned to Mr. Peterson and Miss Jenkins. As for you two, I suggest you research your clients more thoroughly in the future. Attempting to coerce someone into signing away their inheritance could have serious professional consequences. My mother jumped to her feet, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. You ungrateful little, Diane, stop. Aunt Susan's voice cut through the tension as she finally emerged from the kitchen. She looked tired, but resolute. Rebecca's right. This whole thing was wrong from the start. You planned this, my mother accused, whirling on her sister. I let it happen, Aunt Susan admitted, because you swore it was just going to be a family discussion about sharing some expenses. Not. She gestured at the lawyers and documents. Whatever this turned into. Uncle Robert stood as well, straightening his shoulders. I tried to tell you this wouldn't work, Diane. Dad knew exactly what he was doing with his will. He always did. It was the first time I'd heard anyone refer to Grandpa as Dad since his passing, and something about Uncle Robert's tone suggested he was finding his own closure. In this moment, my mother looked around the table, searching for allies and finding none. Carl's expression had shifted from intimidating to calculating, clearly reassessing his position now that the promise of easy money was evaporating. This isn't over, my mother hissed. But her threat sounded hollow, even to my ears. I walked to the door, pausing with my hand on the knob. It is over, Mom. Grandpa made his choice, and I'm honoring it. I would have helped you if you'd approached me honestly about real needs. Instead, you tried to take everything, and now you'll get nothing more from me. The night air felt cleansing as I stepped outside, the weight of months of harassment lifting slightly from my shoulders. I made it to my car on steady legs, closed the door, and turned the key in the ignition before the emotions finally overwhelmed me. I broke down completely once I was safely inside my car and several blocks away from Aunt Susan's house. Violent sobs racked my body, a mixture of relief, grief, and lingering fear, making it impossible to drive further. I pulled into a grocery store parking lot, killed the engine, and let the tears flow freely. When I could finally breathe normally again, I called Maya, my closest friend since college and one of the few people who truly understood my complicated family dynamics. I'm coming over, she said immediately after hearing the tremor in my voice. Wine or ice cream? Both? I answered with a watery laugh. 20 minutes later, we sat on my living room floor, backs against the sofa, a pint of rocky road between us as I recounted the ambush and my unexpected stand against it. I still can't believe I did that, I admitted, licking my spoon. I was terrified the whole time. But you didn't show it, Maya said, raising her wine glass in a toast. Your grandfather would be so proud. The next morning, I called Mr. Goldstein and scheduled an emergency meeting. His corner office, with its dark wood paneling and walls of leather-bound books, had always intimidated me slightly. But today, it felt like a sanctuary. You did exactly the right thing, he assured me after hearing my account. Harold worried something like this might happen. That's why we took such care with the will's language and the supporting documentation. We discussed next steps, including filing for a restraining order against both my mother and Carl. Family court judges hate to get involved in inheritance disputes, Mr. Goldstein explained. But threats and harassment cross the line from civil to potentially criminal matters. The paperwork was filed that afternoon. I left feeling more secure, but also deeply sad that it had come to legal protections against my own mother. That sadness deepened when I opened Facebook later that evening to find my mother had launched a public campaign against me. Her status update, already gathering sympathetic comments, portrayed her as a mother abandoned by an ungrateful daughter who was hoarding a family fortune while she faced homelessness. "Can you believe Rebecca won't help her own mother?" she wrote. "After all I sacrificed raising her alone after her father abandoned us? Now she has millions from my father and won't spare a dime for the woman who gave her life." The blatant rewriting of history, "She hadn't raised me, Grandpa had," was infuriating. But Mr. Goldstein had advised against engaging in public arguments. "That's exactly what she wants," he warned. "Documentation, not confrontation, is your best defense." Still, the damage was done. Family members chose sides, with most distant relatives accepting my mother's version without question. Uncle Robert called to apologize for his initial involvement. "Your grandfather was right about everything," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "I should have stood up to Diane years ago, but it was easier to go along. I'm sorry, Rebecca." Aunt Susan arrived at my door 3 days later with a box of old family photos she'd kept separate from the ones my mother might have accessed. "These belong with you," she said. "Harold gave them to me for safekeeping years ago, worried your mother might sell them like she did so many other family mementos." The pictures, my grandmother as a young bride, Grandpa in his army uniform, my mother as an innocent child, provided a bittersweet glimpse into a family history that now felt fractured beyond repair. Uncle Robert's wife, Nancy, called secretly one evening. "Robert doesn't know I'm calling," she confided. "But I wanted you to know we support you completely. Your mother has been manipulating the family for years, and it's about time someone stood up to her." Cousin Emma proved to be my staunchest ally, defending me fiercely in family group chats and on social media. "I've seen how Aunt Diane treated Rebecca our whole lives," she wrote in one particularly heated exchange. "The only person entitled to that inheritance is the one who actually cared for Grandpa Harold until his last breath, and that's Rebecca." Despite this support, the emotional toll was immense. I installed a security system after finding my mother had attempted to enter the house using an old key while I was at work. The locksmith who changed all the locks looked concerned when I explained the situation. "Family trouble is the worst kind," he said sympathetically. "My sister didn't speak to me for 5 years after our mom passed. Money does strange things to people." Mr. Goldstein sent a formal cease and desist letter to both my mother and her lawyers, outlining the legal consequences of continued harassment or attempts to contest the will. A week later, he called with news. "Miss Jenkins has withdrawn as your mother's counsel," he reported with satisfaction. Apparently, once she realized the full situation, she wasn't comfortable proceeding. "That's a win for us. Reputable attorneys don't like being involved in cases that could lead to ethics complaints." I took practical steps to protect myself financially, placing freezes on my credit, moving my accounts to a different bank than the one my mother used, and documenting every interaction, no matter how small. The constant vigilance was exhausting but necessary. Sleep became elusive. I jolted awake at every noise, convinced my mother or Carl had somehow gotten into the house. Dr. Williams, the therapist I started seeing weekly, diagnosed me with situational anxiety and helped me develop coping strategies. "What you're experiencing is essentially an ongoing trauma response," she explained during one session. "Your brain perceives a constant threat, which is actually rational given the circumstances, but we need to create spaces of safety for you to recover." One of her suggestions was to consider selling Grandpa's house, my house now, and moving somewhere my mother wouldn't immediately think to look. The idea was painful. The house contained so many memories of Grandpa. But after my mother showed up during an open house I was hosting to sell some of Grandpa's shop tools, creating a scene that required police intervention, the idea gained appeal. The officer who responded, a kind-faced woman named Officer Rivera, took detailed notes as I explained the ongoing situation. "You've done everything right with the restraining order and documentation," she assured me. "But sometimes, physical distance is the best protection when someone won't respect boundaries." The final confrontation came unexpectedly at the police station itself. I was there filing an additional report after my mother had left threatening voicemails, despite the restraining order. As I exited the building, she was waiting in the parking lot. "Are you happy now?" she demanded, staying just far enough away to avoid violating the restraining order's distance requirements. "You've turned the whole family against me, stolen what should have been mine, and now you're trying to have me arrested." I said nothing, fishing for my keys while keeping her in my peripheral vision. "I'm giving you one last chance," she continued, her voice rising. Share the inheritance like you should have from the beginning, and I'll forgive all this nonsense. Otherwise, you're no longer my daughter. The ultimatum, meant to devastate me, instead brought a strange sense of clarity. Looking at the angry woman before me, I realized I'd been mourning the mother I wished I had, not the one who actually existed. Goodbye, Diane, I said calmly, using her first name for the first time in my life. I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for. As I drove away, I caught a glimpse of her stunned expression in my rearview mirror. It was the last time I would see her for nearly 2 years. 6 months after the confrontation at the police station, I stood in the empty living room of my new condo, watching the morning light stream through floor-to-ceiling windows. The space was nothing like Grandpa's cozy, slightly cluttered home. It was modern, secure, and most importantly, my mother had no idea where to find me. I had sold the family house to a young couple expecting their first child. The husband was a contractor who appreciated the solid craftsmanship and promised to preserve the character while updating the systems. It felt right somehow that another family would fill those rooms with new memories. The proceeds from the sale, combined with some of the investment funds, allowed me to put a substantial down payment on this 2-bedroom condo in a secure building with underground parking and a doorman. I donated most of Grandpa's furniture to veterans organizations, but kept special pieces: his reading chair, the oak desk where he taught me bookkeeping, and the handmade quilt my grandmother had created that had covered his bed throughout my childhood. Professional security wasn't my only motivation for moving. I had also decided to start my own accounting practice, focusing on small businesses and contractors like Grandpa. The second bedroom became my home office, with his desk as its centerpiece. Mitchell Financial Services launched with 5 clients, former business associates of Grandpa's who trusted his judgment enough to give his granddaughter a chance. Their recommendations brought others, and within months, I was busy enough to consider hiring an assistant. To honor Grandpa's memory in a more public way, I established the Harold Mitchell Scholarship for Trade Education, providing funding for students pursuing careers in construction and skilled trades. The first recipient was a single mother studying electrical work, who reminded me of the determination Grandpa had always admired. Dr. Williams continued to help me process the trauma of my mother's betrayal and the complicated grief of losing both my grandfather and any illusion of a healthy relationship with my mother. Grief isn't just about death, she explained during one particularly difficult session. It's about the loss of what might have been, the futures we imagined that can never happen now. I grieved the mother I'd never really had, the one who might have protected and nurtured me instead of seeing me as a means to financial gain. That grief was necessary before real healing could begin. Maya remained my steadfast support, dropping by with takeout on nights when client work kept me late and insisting on mandatory fun days when she sensed I was working too hard. Her perspective, as someone who had watched my relationship with my mother deteriorate over years, helped validate my decision to maintain distance. You gave her so many chances, Maya reminded me over Thai food one evening. At some point, protecting yourself isn't selfish, it's survival. A new relationship also entered my life unexpectedly. Thomas, a civil engineer who had consulted on one of my client's projects, asked me to coffee after our third professional meeting. His quiet intelligence and genuine interest in my thoughts rather than my circumstances was refreshingly different from previous relationships. When I finally told him about my family situation after several weeks of dating, his response was simple but profound. "Thank you for trusting me with that story. It explains your strength." With Thomas, I began exploring hobbies Grandpa had always encouraged, but I'd never found time for. Photography became a particular passion, with weekend trips to capture Oregon's stunning landscapes. Grandpa had been an amateur photographer himself, and using his old Nikon camera connected me to him in a new way. We visited places Grandpa had always talked about seeing, but never reached: the redwood forests of Northern California, the rugged Washington coast, the painted hills of Eastern Oregon. I brought his fishing hut along on these journeys, sometimes placing it in photos as a silent acknowledgement of his continued presence in my life. My father, who had remained a distant figure even after Grandpa's passing, reached out unexpectedly after seeing the scholarship announcement in an industry newsletter. Our first phone call was awkward, years of absence creating a chasm neither of us quite knew how to bridge. "I should have been there," he admitted. "For you and for Harold. He was a better father to you than I ever was." Subsequent conversations revealed aspects of my parents' relationship I'd never understood. My father described my mother's gambling even during their marriage, how she'd hidden debt, manipulated family and friends, and eventually made co-parenting impossible with her erratic behavior and demands. "I thought leaving was the only way to escape," he explained. "I didn't realize until much later that I'd abandoned you to the same situation. By then, Harold made it clear you were better off with him than bouncing between homes." This new perspective didn't excuse his absence, but helped me understand. It wasn't simple selfishness that had driven his decisions. We began building a cautious relationship, meeting for lunch when his work brought him to the West Coast, sharing occasional phone calls. Aunt Susan and I developed a closer bond than we'd ever had during Grandpa's life. She invited me for Sunday dinners, introduced me to her book club, and shared stories about Grandpa's younger years I'd never heard. He wasn't always the wise, patient man you knew, she told me one evening as we looked through old photographs. After your grandmother died, he was lost for nearly 2 years. Angry at the world, drinking too much, pushing everyone away. Then one day, Diane dropped you off for a weekend and just didn't come back for almost a month. Something about having you there, needing him, pulled him back to himself. The winter holidays, always Grandpa's favorite time of year, presented a challenge. I dreaded the empty house, the absence of his tradition of making homemade eggnog and telling increasingly embellished stories of holidays past. Instead of spending the time alone, I hosted a gathering for what Maya called my chosen family, friends, clients who had become friends, Thomas, Aunt Susan, Uncle Robert and Nancy, and cousins including Emma. We shared memories of Grandpa, and I used his recipe cards to recreate his famous prime rib and Yorkshire pudding, only slightly burning the latter. As we raised glasses in a toast to absent loved ones, I felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the crackling fireplace. Grandpa had taught me that family was more about actions than blood, and the people surrounding me had proven that repeatedly. In January, nearly 18 months after our last encounter, I received a letter with no return address. The handwriting was instantly recognizable, my mother's. For days, I left it unopened on my kitchen counter, anxiety spiking whenever I passed it. Thomas offered to read it at first, but this was something I needed to face myself. The letter was postmarked from Arizona and written on stationery from a rehabilitation facility. My mother explained she had hit rock bottom after our last confrontation, gambling away the $50,000 inheritance and accumulating dangerous debts. After what she called a way-up call, which I later learned was an arrest for theft, she had entered treatment for gambling addiction and alcoholism. I don't expect forgiveness, she wrote. I probably don't deserve it, but I am sorry, truly sorry for everything I've done to hurt you. The program requires making amends where possible, though I understand if you want nothing to do with me. Dr. Williams helped me process my conflicted feelings about the letter. You don't need to make any decisions immediately, she advised. Your response, or choice not to respond, should serve your healing, not her need for absolution. I waited a month before sending a brief reply, acknowledging her treatment and wishing her well, but establishing clear boundaries about my willingness to re-engage. It was the beginning of a very cautious, very distant relationship, conducted entirely through occasional letters. The anniversary of Grandpa's death brought a pilgrimage to his grave with flowers, lilies, his favorite. I sat on the cold ground, telling him about the business, the scholarship, Thomas, and all the other developments in a life that was finally thriving rather than just surviving. As I was leaving, the cemetery groundskeeper approached with a package. Are you Rebecca? He asked. When I nodded, he explained, a man left this about 10 years ago with instructions to give it to a Rebecca Mitchell if she ever visited this plot after his burial. Said you'd come eventually. The package contained Grandpa's journal from the year after my grandmother died, the period Aunt Susan had described as his darkest. His entries chronicled his grief, confusion, and eventual redemption through caring for a small granddaughter who needed stability. The final entry read, Rebecca fell asleep tonight while I was reading to her. Looking at her little face, I realized Martha sent her to save me, not the other way around. Whatever happens in my life from this point forward, that little girl is my true legacy. Not the business, not the money, but the love we've built together. I clutched the journal to my chest, tears flowing freely but without the sting of grief. This was something else, gratitude, connection, and the certainty that the best parts of him continued through me. 2 years after the confrontation at Aunt Susan's house, Mitchell Financial Services had grown into a respected firm with 4 employees and a client list that had doubled quarterly. The office space I'd leased downtown featured brick walls, hardwood floors, and large windows, a blend of traditional craftsmanship and modern function that felt like a tribute to Grandpa's values. My personal transformation had been equally significant. The timid, conflict-avoidant young woman who had once feared her mother's disapproval had become someone who confidently set boundaries, trusted her judgment, and built a life aligned with her values rather than others' expectations. The business allowed me to honor Grandpa's legacy in practical ways. We specialized in helping small construction companies and skilled tradespeople manage their finances, offering sliding scale rates for startups founded by women and minorities. Groups Grandpa had always supported in an industry that hadn't always welcomed them. The Harold Mitchell Scholarship had expanded to support 5 students annually, and I regularly visited trade schools to speak about financial literacy for small business owners. Seeing young people pursue careers similar to my grandfather's with enthusiasm and pride was profoundly satisfying. My relationship with my mother had evolved into something neither of us could have predicted. After completing her rehabilitation program, she had remained in Arizona, finding work as an administrative assistant at a senior living community. Our communication, once limited to occasional letters, had gradually included phone calls on birthdays and major holidays. There was no pretense of a complete reconciliation or a return to conventional mother-daughter closeness. Too much damage had occurred for that. Instead, we had established a careful relationship based on clear boundaries and limited expectations. "I'm not the mother you deserved," she acknowledged during one phone call. "I can't change the past, but I'm trying to be someone who at least doesn't make your present worse." It was perhaps the most honest statement she'd ever made to me, and I appreciated it more than declarations of maternal love that had proven hollow throughout my childhood. When she asked if she could visit Portland, I suggested meeting at a restaurant rather than my home, a boundary she respected without complaint, another sign of genuine change. Our lunch was awkward but civil, the conversation carefully navigating around trigger topics like money or Grandpa's will. Before leaving, she handed me a small box. "I found this in a pawn shop in Phoenix," she explained. I recognized it immediately. Inside was my grandmother's pearl bracelet, one of the pieces my mother had sold years earlier for gambling money. The effort to find and repurchase it, while a small gesture compared to the harm done, represented more meaningful amends than grand apologies or promises. Aunt Susan had gradually become the maternal figure I'd always needed. Our Sunday dinners evolving into a cherished ritual. She'd recently started dating a kind-hearted retired teacher who treated her with the respect she deserved, and seeing her happiness brought me joy. "Your grandfather would be so proud of how you've handled everything," she told me one evening as we washed dishes side by side. "Not just the business success, but the way you've maintained your compassion while protecting yourself." Uncle Robert and I had developed a comfortable relationship built largely around memories of Grandpa and an appreciation for craft beer. He'd become an unexpected ally in preserving family history, digitizing old photos and recording family stories for future generations. Thomas had become my partner in every sense, moving into the condo after a year of dating. His pragmatic approach to problems balanced my occasional tendency toward anxiety, while my emotional intelligence helped him navigate complicated family dynamics of his own. When he proposed during a weekend photography trip to the coast, using Grandpa's fishing spot as the backdrop, the moment felt blessed by a presence I couldn't see but deeply felt. My engagement ring wasn't a traditional diamond, but a sapphire set in my grandmother's gold band, another family piece Aunt Susan had protected from my mother's financial desperation years earlier. Cousin Emma, who had stood by me throughout the inheritance drama, was the first person I called with the news. Her excitement was tempered only by her immediate demand to be made maid of honor, a role already promised to Maya. Though Emma graciously accepted the compromise of being my person of honor instead, we planned a small wedding at Trillium Lake, where Grandpa had taught me to fish and where Thomas and I had spent countless weekends photographing dawn reflections on the water. Traditional father-daughter traditions were adjusted. Uncle Robert would walk me down the aisle, and I planned a special tribute to Grandpa, including his fishing hat and favorite Hemingway quote in the ceremony. The inheritance that had caused such conflict had become a foundation for good rather than a source of division. Beyond the scholarship program, I'd established a habit of anonymous giving to causes Grandpa had supported, veterans organizations, literacy programs, and vocational training initiatives. I had also helped Cousin Emma escape similar family pressure when she received a modest inheritance from her paternal grandmother. My experience had taught me to recognize the warning signs of financial exploitation, and I connected her with Mr. Goldstein before her father, my uncle on my mother's side, could manipulate her into sharing what was rightfully hers. My life had found a balance that once seemed impossible. The panic attacks that had plagued me after the confrontation had faded with time and therapy. I still maintained careful privacy about my address and finances where my mother was concerned, but no longer jumped at unexpected knocks or screamed at every unknown call. On a bright spring morning, much like the day Grandpa passed, I sat in my home office looking at expansion plans for the business. His photo watched over me from a simple frame on the desk, his expression serious, but with a hint of a smile in his eyes that those who loved him always recognized. Beside it sat the journal he'd left with the cemetery groundskeeper, a tangible reminder that love outlasts both life and betrayal. I often reread entries when facing difficult decisions, finding his wisdom still relevant years later. The inheritance had never been about the money. It had been Grandpa's final lesson in standing firm, valuing yourself, and recognizing that sometimes the most loving choice isn't the easiest one. By refusing to surrender what he had entrusted to me, I had honored his legacy far more than I would have by giving it away to appease someone who had repeatedly proven untrustworthy. Thomas knocked gently on the office door, breaking my reverie. "Your 9 o'clock consultation is here," he reminded me with a smile. "The Father-Son Plumbing Company." I nodded, gathering my notes and taking a last glance at Grandpa's photo. Sometimes, I could almost hear him chuckling with satisfaction at how things had turned out. Not just the business success or financial security, but the strength I discovered within myself when pushed to my limits. That strength had always been there, planted and nurtured by a man who saw potential where others saw only a burden. The inheritance had merely been the catalyst for its emergence. As I walked into the conference room to greet my new clients, I carried that knowledge with me, a legacy far more valuable than any sum of money. Have you ever had to set difficult boundaries with loved ones for your own well-being?